All right, everybody, the next thing we're going to take a look at in our essay, we've looked at our introduction, we've looked at our topic sentences for our essay structure. Now we're going to take a double check on our context, paraphrasing, and quoting of evidence. We want to look at how we presented evidence in our essay. So the first thing we want to talk about is giving context. Anytime you have a quote, you have to give context so the reader understands what's happening prior to the evidence. When you don't give context, a teacher calls that a quote bomb. That means you're just suddenly randomly talking, you got a quote in there, and you haven't introduced it or explained what it is that it's trying to prove. In order to give a quote, you need to state the context. The context states, 1, what is happening in the story when the quote occurs, and 2, who is talking to whom. You must have those items before every single time you give any kind of evidence, especially a quote. All right, now there's 2 ways to give evidence. You don't always have to quote the text. One way is by paraphrasing, which involves putting a passage from the text into your own words. Paraphrasing evidence is shorter than the original passage and should be used if quoted evidence would take more than a line or 2 of space in your paragraph. Especially if you are quoting more than one paragraph, you're better off paraphrasing it. Paraphrasing it is a summary using specific textual references. So here's an example. TJ told the Logan kids that the Sims brothers would get him anything he wanted, including the pearl-handled pistol at the Barnett store. If you recall, that's a few different paragraphs. However, here I've got TJ is who's talking, what he told them, TJ said, specific who he's talking to, the Sims brothers who he's talking about, would get him anything he wanted. Those are exact words from that quote. Or from that part of the text, including the pearl-handled pistol. Those are also exact words, specific textual references at the Barnett store. All specific textual references. This is not plagiarism. This is a paraphrasing because it's summarizing 2 paragraphs, pulling exact words from the text and making it into shorter terms. Now, you can also quote evidence. If you're making a quote, it must be identical to the original text. Using the exact words from the text and the page number must be cited within the sentence. So a quote needs to be introduced with a dialogue tag explaining who is speaking. Otherwise, you got a quote bomb. So here, TJ said, that's my dialogue tag. Anything, just anything I want, they'll get it from me, including that pearl-handled pistol in Barnett's Mercantile. So no, if I look at this, I don't know who they is. So if I'm putting this quote in, I need to have identified who they is within the context clues that I'm giving. I also need to, where are they? Who is TJ talking to? All of that needs to be included in the context coming before this quote. Several of you have expressed the desire to put dialogue within a quote, which means that you're quoting both the narration and dialogue. If that's something that you want to try, I encourage you to do so. I will not take points off if you try it because I'd like you to try new things. However, if you don't need to do so, you don't need to do so. I won't take points off if you do it or don't do it, even if it's incorrect. So let's talk about this for a second. Dialogue within a quote means that you've got both narration and dialogue, both what Cassie's saying and then what Cassie's quoting somebody else is saying. So in this case, you need to use double quotation marks around the whole quote and single quotation marks around the dialogue. So here's the example that I've got for you. TJ brings the Simses to the revival to show off. Note my context there. He attempts to make the Logans jealous by saying, anything, just anything at all I want. They'll get it for me, including, he hesitated as if he were unsure whether or not he was going too far, then plunged on, including that pearl-handled pistol in Barnett's Mercantile. All right, let's take a look. First, I've got my context. TJ brings the Simses to the revival to show off. I've got what's happening in the story at this point. I've got TJ talking, attempts to make the Logans jealous, who he's talking to by saying. So I've identified who's talking to whom. Then I've got 2 quotation marks around the entire thing. I've got 2 quotation marks around the entire thing. I've got 1 quotation mark around dialogue. Anything, just anything I want, they'll get it for me, including 1 quotation mark, because that's the part that he says. Still in my double quotation marks, he hesitated as if he were unsure whether or not he was going too far, then plunged on. That should say too far. I mistyped it. And then plunged on, including, note now, this is part of his, what TJ's saying again, and then this is where that ends, including that pearl-handled pistol in Barnett's Mercantile. So notice, this quote is open and closed, this dialogue is open and closed, and I've also got the 2 quotation marks open and closed. Okay? So if the quotation marks open, the quotation marks have to close. Single quotation marks open and close inside of the double quotation marks. Okay, now let's see if I catch any of my own typos in this part. Good writers always introduce evidence with context, a brief summary of what's currently happening that leads to a specific piece of evidence. Good writers explain who is speaking to whom, the narrator is describing or the character speaking. Even if it's the narrator, good writers indicate that it's the narrator speaking. Good writers use paraphrased and quoted evidence for variety. Okay? You don't want to always have the same thing. You do not need more than 1 quote per paragraph. You're best off if you have some paraphrased evidence and some quoted evidence in every paragraph. All longer evidence needs to be paraphrased. Paraphrase longer sections of text so the evidence doesn't take up too much space in the paragraph. You should never ever have a paragraph that's more than a full sheet of paper. That's too long of a paragraph. That should always be a partial sheet of paper. Lastly, good writers use direct quotations of shorter text, narration, or dialogue as evidence to demonstrate the point that the writer is making. Okay, so good. They also use quotation marks. What I'd like you to do right now, here are your steps, is to, number 1, I'd like you to read your essay again. Number 2, I want you to reflect specifically on the context, right? The what's happening, and who's talking, to whom. Okay? I also want you to reflect on the evidence. Decide if something needs to be changed to being paraphrased, or if something should be quoted. And if it's quoted, check your use of quotation marks. What I should have also noted up here is you always need those page citations. So you should have 2 minimum page citations in every paragraph because you hopefully have at least 2 pieces of evidence in every page citation. So again, what I want you to do right now is read your essay again. I want you to reflect on the context, and I want you to reflect on the evidence. Okay? And then ultimately, I want you to correct anything that you see that isn't quite right. All right, great. Thanks. Have a good night, day, whatever it is.